So, every single day, there are roughly 100,000 scheduled airplane flights that land safely across the globe.
Yeah, which is just a staggering number when you sit and
Oh,
think about it.
right. And, you look out the window of a 737, you see the flaps adjust, you feel the thrust of the engines, and you probably think about engineering.
Sure. Or aerodynamics.
Yeah, aerodynamics. But the texts we are investigating today, they look at those 100,000 safe landings and call them a miracle of real-time divine micromanagement.
Which is a massive paradigm shift.
It really is. So welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today our mission is an exhaustive investigation into God's meticulous, continuous providence over the natural world.
And we have some very dense material to get through.
We do. We are pulling our insights from two specific theological texts. The first is the sovereign architect of the elements, and the second is the theater of God's rule.
Both of which demand a complete reevaluation of the physical universe.
Yeah, they do. They challenge the very core of how modern people interact with their environment.
Right. I mean, if you buy into the arguments made by these authors, the Weather Channel is no longer just a meteorological forecast.
What does it become then?
It becomes a daily report on divine activity.
Wow. Okay, so to set the stage for you, the listener, we need to establish our theological framing.
Yes, that's crucial.
Both of us approach this analysis as Protestant Christians who hold to Reformed theology. We adhere to the Westminster Confession.
Right. And that framework heavily guides how we interpret these texts today.
It does. And speaking directly to you, the listener, whether you are checking your weather app right now, or maybe you're worried about an incoming storm, or simply tending to a small garden in your backyard, this discussion will fundamentally alter how you view the physical world around you.
It changes the very nature of how you perceive, a breeze against your face or a bird landing on your fence.
Absolutely. Now, before we jump in, I do want to acknowledge a quick ground rule we set for this deep dive.
All right.
We are going to take turns speaking fully. We want to ensure we don't interrupt each other's main trains of thought, so you get the most out of this analysis.
But we'll still keep it conversational, of course.
Right. Yeah. Lots of natural back and forth, but we won't talk over the dense theology.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's jump right into the core premise. To understand how the Creator interacts with the physical world, the authors argue we first have to tear down the secular assumptions we unconsciously adopt every single day.
Which are everywhere.
They are. The sources forcefully reject the concept of Mother Nature, they reject Darwinian evolution, and they totally discard the idea of a universe running on impersonal natural laws.
Yeah, they argue those are essentially modern myths.
So how do they back that up historically?
Well, what is fascinating here is how the sources trace this historical battle of ideas. They contrast our modern secularism with the ancient Near Eastern context.
The ANE.
Right. In the ancient world, nations like the Canaanites and Babylonians lived in absolute terror of their environment.
Because they didn't understand it.
Partially, but mostly because they worshipped deities like Baal, who was known in their mythology as the rider of the clouds or the lord of the storm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they believed weather was the result of chaotic battles between finite, capricious gods. So if it rained, Baal was winning.
And if there was a drought?
Then Mot, the god of death, had the upper hand.
So the average person living in the ancient world was just constantly trying to appease these chaotic, unpredictable forces.
Exactly. I mean, precisely. They were terrified victims of a cosmic war.
But the Hebrew scriptures step in and shatter that mythological darkness, right?
Yes. The texts point to the historical setting of the Exodus. When Yahweh brought plagues upon Egypt, he was not performing random magic tricks.
Right, it was targeted.
Highly targeted. He was executing a systematic, covenantal judgment upon the supposed gods of Egypt.
Can you give an example from the text?
Sure. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile as the source of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
By turning it to blood, Yahweh proved total jurisdiction over the water.
Oh, I see.
And they worshipped Ra, the sun god. By summoning unnatural darkness, Yahweh demonstrated that celestial bodies move only at his command.
So the biblical view established there is that Yahweh alone is the sovereign architect. He has no rivals in the atmosphere.
Spot on.
Now, the sources provide a very clear definition of what providence actually is, and they contrast it heavily with what it is not.
Right, because people misunderstand that word all the time.
They really do. The authors say it is not bare foreknowledge. It is not God just sitting in heaven, looking down the corridor of time and passively seeing what the weather will be next Tuesday.
Right.
Providence is defined as his continuous, active, and purposeful governance of all creation. He is the one actively making the weather happen.
Yes, and that brings us back to that staggering statistic you mentioned earlier, the 100,000 airplane flights.
Right. How does that tie into providence?
The authors use that to illustrate the concept of common grace within this active providence. We take a safe landing for granted.
We just grab our carry-on and walk off.
Exactly. But the sources argue that such a feat requires millions of mechanical variables, atmospheric pressures, and aerodynamic laws to perfectly conspire under the governing hand of the Almighty.
That is wow.
And the unregenerate world offers no thanks for this. They attribute it to human engineering or just blind luck.
But the authors argue differently.
Yes, they argue that gravity, lift, and drag are not independent forces. They're simply the names we give to God's ordinary, consistent way of holding the world together.
That makes me think of an analogy. I think about the secular view of the universe like a wind-up clock left on a shelf.
Okay, unpack that.
So a clockmaker builds the gears, winds it up, sets it down, and just walks away. The gears turn on their own because of the initial energy.
Right, deism, basically.
Yeah, but the biblical view of providence presented here is more like a live orchestra. The conductor is not sitting in the audience watching the musicians play. He is actively directing every single musician, every single note in real time.
That's a great visual.
And if the conductor puts his baton down, the music stops instantly.
The orchestra analogy captures the theological concept of preservation and governance flawlessly.
How so?
Well, preservation means he sustains the existence of all things, while governance means he directs them to their appointed end.
Wait, let me push back on that for a second.
Sure.
If God is micromanaging every atom, every gust of wind, and every aerodynamic variable on those 100,000 airplanes, why do we bother studying meteorology?
That's the classic objection.
Right. Like, why build earthquake-resistant homes if the Almighty is dictating every single vibration of the Earth? Does this meticulous sovereignty render human action or scientific inquiry pointless?
It's a fair question, and the sources anticipate that exact concern. They introduce the concept of secondary causes alongside the concursus of the divine will.
Concursus. What does that mean in this context?
The authors explain that God works through natural means. He is the primary cause, but he utilizes the laws of physics, the skill of the architect, and the study of the meteorologist as his secondary causes.
Okay, I think I'm tracking.
So our actions and our scientific studies observe the how. Science catalogs the mechanisms God uses.
And theology.
Theology answers the who and the why. Studying meteorology is simply studying the ordinary, regular patterns of God's governance.
So building an earthquake-resistant home isn't a lack of faith?
Not at all. It is an act of responsible stewardship, utilizing the natural laws God has established. We are commanded to be wise stewards of the physical properties he maintains.
Okay, so the scientific method is basically just observing the regular habits of the Creator. That makes sense. We are observing the consistent way the conductor directs the orchestra.
That's a great way to summarize it.
Now that we've established this massive, all-encompassing scale of governance, let's transition. Let's look at how this applies to the most massive physical structures on our planet, the ground and the oceans.
The macro domains.
Right. The sources state that the Creator possesses absolute rights over the planet. They cite Psalm 24.1, "The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof."
And the textual analysis the authors provide on this point is rigorous. They examine Numbers chapter 16.
Is that the narrative of Korah?
Yes, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram rebelling against Moses in the wilderness.
Okay, what do the authors say about that?
They insist that when the earth opened its mouth to swallow these men, it was not a random tectonic shift.
It wasn't just bad timing.
No. It was not an accidental, localized earthquake that just happened to perfectly coincide with Moses finishing his sentence.
Wow.
It was an obedient execution of divine judgment. The earth is not neutral ground. It is the property of its maker, and the tectonic plates act upon his direct command.
That is a heavy thought. And the sources give equal weight to the domain of water, too.
Yes, water provides both sustenance and destruction.
Right, and God governs both extremes. They reference Jesus calming the Sea of Galilee, the splitting of the Red Sea during the Exodus, and a fascinating, very specific passage from Amos chapter 4, verse 7.
Where God states he withheld rain from one city and caused it to fall on another.
Yes. The linguistic breakdown the sources provide on these passages is just critical for understanding the theology.
They highlight specific Hebrew grammatical nuances, right?
Yeah, they do. They focus heavily on the hifil stem, used in passages like Psalm 147 and Psalm 104.
For the listener who doesn't read Hebrew, can you explain the hifil stem?
Sure. So in Hebrew, verbs have various stems that change the nature of the action. The hifil is the causative stem.
Causative, meaning causing something to happen.
Yes. When the text says God makes the wind blow and the waters flow, the causative stem proves that the flowing of water is not a passive, independent natural process.
Okay.
It is a direct result of God initiating the command. He actively causes the springs to gush forth.
That is fascinating.
And there's more. The analysis of Amos 3.6 is devastating to the secular mindset.
Remind me that verse.
The prophet asks, does disaster come to a city and the Lord has not done it?
Oh, right.
The authors break down the rhetorical force of this Hebrew phrasing to argue explicitly against the idea that natural disasters happen independently of God's decree. The assumed answer to the prophet's rhetorical question is a resounding no.
No, disaster does not come unless he has done it.
Right. Thinking about water in God's hands, it feels a lot like a surgeon's scalpel to me.
A scalpel? How so?
Well, a scalpel has no will of its own. It cannot decide to cut. In the hands of a skilled surgeon, it is capable of bringing necessary healing, like, cutting away a deadly tumor. Or it can execute sharp, painful judgment, but it never acts on its own accord. It only moves where the hand guides it, applying the exact amount of pressure the surgeon intends.
A scalpel is an excellent visual for the dual nature of water as presented in the text. Both a life-giving resource required for human flourishing and an instrument of catastrophic judgment.
I have to challenge this, though.
Go ahead.
The emotional weight of this is staggering. It is incredibly easy to praise God for a gentle spring rain that waters the crops. We sing hymns about that.
We do.
But assigning a devastating tsunami, which wipes out thousands of lives and levels entire coastlines, assigning that to his act of governance is a very hard pill to swallow.
It is.
How do the sources suggest a believer handle that heavy, tragic reality without losing their faith?
That is the core pastoral issue here. The authors do not shy away from the emotional gravity of that reality.
What do they say?
They point to a rigorous critique of the concept of bare permission.
Bare permission.
Yeah. Some theologies try to protect God's reputation by arguing that he just permits bad things to happen. They suggest she steps back, removes his hand, and lets nature run wild.
Just kind of letting it happen without intending it.
Right. But the sources argue that a God who is only present in pleasant weather but absent in terror is not the God of the Bible.
That makes sense historically, based on what we discussed.
They assert that meaningful suffering under a sovereign God offers vastly better comfort than meaningless suffering in a random, chaotic universe.
Wow.
Think about it. If God simply permitted a tsunami without any purpose, unable or unwilling to stop it, then the resulting suffering is random, it's hollow, it's absurd.
Just a tragic accident.
Right. But if he governed it, even in his secret and hidden wisdom, the believer can trust that the suffering has an ultimate holy purpose, even if that purpose remains entirely mysterious to us in this life.
That requires an immense amount of trust.
It really does.
It means letting go of our demand for immediate answers and resting in the character of the sovereign architect.
Yes.
So we can see the ocean, we can see the earth, but what about the forces we cannot see? The deep dive transitions into the invisible forces, specifically the wind.
This is a great section.
Yeah, this proves his authority isn't limited to what the human eye can track. The sources describe wind as coming from God's storehouses.
The scriptural evidence marshaled here is vast. Psalm 107 vividly details how God commands the stormy wind to rise, lifting the waves and terrifying the sailors.
And then he calms it.
Exactly. With equal authority, he commands it to be still. The Exodus narrative is brought up again here.
Oh, with the locusts?
Yes, noting how God specifically used a strong east wind to bring the plague of locusts across the land, and then intentionally shifted the atmospheric pressure to a strong west wind to drive them away into the sea.
So the wind is portrayed as a highly trained, highly responsive servant.
It is.
The sources spend a good deal of time on the New Testament application of this too. Specifically, the story of Jesus asleep in the boat during the severe storm on the Sea of Galilee.
The Greek analysis of that moment is exceptional.
Let's dig into that.
When Jesus stands up to calm the storm, the text notes the specific Greek word he uses to address the wind.
Which is?
Piphimuso. Literally translated, it means be muzzled.
Muzzled, like a dog.
Yes. The authors argue that Christ is not speaking to the storm as a frightened observer, hoping for good weather. He is speaking to it as its creator, commanding a subordinate rowdy creature to be quiet.
That's a vivid image.
He muzzles the wind in the exact same way one would muzzle a barking dog.
The authors also point out a glaring hypocrisy in human nature regarding this.
Oh, about gratitude.
Yes. They argue that human blindness is exposed when people angrily question God during a hurricane, demanding to know where he is and why he allowed it.
Right.
But they completely fail to offer any thanks for the thousands of days when gentle breezes sustain life safely without causing any damage.
It is a selective outrage. And the authors say it exposes a practical atheism in the human heart.
Practical atheism, because they don't actually believe he's in control of the good weather either.
Precisely. Men demand accountability from God for the destructive wind, holding him liable for the damage. But they claim the peaceful wind is just a meaningless natural occurrence requiring no gratitude.
We tend to think of the wind as a wild, untamable beast. You know, we cannot cage it, we cannot control it, we can barely predict it, even with all our satellite technology. Yet, to the Creator, that same wild beast acts as a perfectly trained, obedient dog. He says, sit, and the wind drops. He says, attack, and it becomes a Category 5 hurricane.
The contrast between human impotence and divine omnipotence is the central theme of that domain. We are entirely at the mercy of the elements, while the elements are entirely at the mercy of God.
So let me ask a clarifying question here. If the wind is an instrument of divine command, should we view every single weather anomaly as a specific, targeted judgment? Like if a tornado hits a town in the Midwest, are the authors suggesting we need to figure out what sin that town committed to deserve that specific wind? Are we supposed to act like ancient prophets diagnosing the weather?
This raises an essential question about how we interpret providence, and the expert consensus in the text clarifies that while every wind fulfills his word, his specific reasons often remain entirely hidden from us.
So we shouldn't guess.
Right. We are not given access to the secret counsel of his will. The authors strongly caution against trying to read the weather like tea leaves.
Okay, that's a relief.
The goal of understanding this doctrine is not to become superstitious weather readers, trying to divine specific judgments from every thunderstorm. We do not have the inspired authority to say, this tornado hit because of this specific sin.
And what is the goal?
The goal is to cultivate a general posture of reverence, awe, and trust, knowing that wherever the wind is doing, it is doing the will of the Father.
It comes back to resting in the who, even when we do not know the why.
Exactly.
So having established God's reign over these massive, terrifying forces like the ocean and the storm, the discussion zooms way in. We look at the microscopic, the quiet, the ordinary details of daily life, flora and fauna, plants and animals.
The level of detail the authors draw from the biblical text here is just fascinating.
Let's start with plants.
Regarding plants, the text asserts that God actively causes the grass to grow. They do not view photosynthesis as an autonomous process.
They bring up Jonah, don't they?
Yes, they draw heavily on the book of Jonah.
Yeah.
In that narrative, God appointed a plant to grow and provide shade for Jonah. The Hebrew word used is manna, but God also appointed a worm to destroy that very same plant the next day.
So the same word is used for both.
Yes. The exact same divine decree governed the miraculous growth of the vine and the microscopic destructive chewing at the worm.
And Jesus himself commands us to look at the flowers to understand this, doesn't he?
He does, and the authors provide a Greek word study on Jesus' command to consider the lilies.
What's the Greek word?
The Greek word is katamathete.
Katamathete.
Right. It does not mean a casual glance or noticing a flower as you walk by. It implies an intensive observation, a rigorous, focused study.
Oh, wow.
Jesus is commanding believers to intensely analyze the plant life around them, to learn the logic of divine providence. You are supposed to look at the intricate design of a petal and extrapolate that to the care God has for your life.
That shifts how you walk through a park.
Completely.
The sources go into just as much detail regarding the animal kingdom, too. They mention ravens being commanded to feed Elijah meat and bread in the wilderness.
Which totally violates a raven's natural scavenging instinct.
Right. And they mention the mouths of hungry lions being sovereignly restrained to protect Daniel in the den. But the ultimate proof text they provide is from Matthew 10.29, analyzing the fall of a single sparrow.
This is perhaps the most meticulous exegetical work in the sources. The authors break down the Greek syntax tree of Matthew 10.29.
Walk us through that.
Jesus says a sparrow does not fall to the ground apart from the Father. The Greek phrase is anotou patros.
Anotou patros.
Yes. The analysis shows that this prepositional phrase directly modifies the verb for the bird falling. It literally means that a bird's death lacks the authorizing consent of the father if it were to fall on its own.
Authorizing consent.
Right. A bird cannot die, a predator cannot strike it, it cannot starve without the sovereign signed decree of the Almighty granting authorizing consent.
That leads to the lesser to greater logic from the Sermon on the Mount.
Unpack that.
If God meticulously governed the temporary disposable garments of the grass and signs the death warrant of a 5-cent sparrow, the anxiety of a believer is essentially practical atheism.
That's a strong statement.
It is living as if God is not in control of the details.
The authors argue that worry is a theological failure. It is a refusal to reckon with the microscopic governance of the Creator. To worry is to act as though you are an orphan in a random universe rather than a child of the sovereign architect.
I would liken God's attention in this domain to a master computer programmer.
Okay, I like this.
A human programmer might write the broad architecture of a software system, set the parameters, and let automated processes handle the background data. The programmer isn't micromanaging every single pixel on the monitor.
Right, that would be impossible for a human.
But the biblical God does not just write the broad architecture. He personally, manually codes every single line of data, down to the smallest pixel on the screen, in real time. Nothing is automated in the universe.
The programmer analogy highlights the continuous active nature of providence. He is upholding the code at every fraction of a second. If he stopped coding, the screen would go blank.
Now, let me pose a difficult question regarding the animals.
Go for it.
If the smallest sparrow's death is sanctioned by God, and if he appoints the worm to kill the plant, does this mean God takes joy in the predatory, violent nature of the animal kingdom?
That's a tough one.
Is the brutal reality of a lion tearing apart a gazelle or a parasite destroying a host a reflection of his ideal, perfect design?
The authors anticipate this theological dilemma. They bring in a specific dispensational perspective on Romans chapter 8.
What does Romans 8 say about this?
The text explains that the current natural world is groaning under the curse resulting from the fall of mankind. The predatory nature we see in animals, the violence of the food chain, the thorns and thistles, this is a visceral echo of the curse. It is not the final, restored design of creation. God governs the violence right now, using it within his fallen world, but he doesn't view it as the ultimate, perfected state of his kingdom. It is a temporary mechanism under the curse.
That distinction is incredibly helpful. It means we don't have to call the brutal realities of nature good in an ultimate sense, even while acknowledging God governs them.
Exactly.
Now, because this theology of meticulous sovereignty is so absolute, it inevitably collides with modern thought. The authors wage a fierce theological defense against competing worldviews.
As is the polemic section.
Yes, and it is critical we outline how the authors apply this today. They go after both sides of the modern political and theological aisles.
They don't pull any punches.
No, they don't. And I need to explicitly state something for you, the listener, before we dive into this. The sources contain politically charged critiques. They specifically target left-wing social justice movements and critical race theory, alongside right-wing charismatic movements.
So they hit the whole spectrum.
They do. As an impartial analysis of this text, we are not endorsing either side of the modern political aisle. We are simply reporting the author's argument, which is that believers must prioritize the vertical reality of God's rule over horizontal, secular frameworks.
That's a helpful disclaimer. And their polemical arguments are very robust.
Who do they start with?
They explicitly attack Arminianism, open theism, the prosperity gospel, secularism, liberalism, and critical race theory.
Let's break those down. How do they address Arminianism and open theism?
They reject the idea that God simply permits tragedies while his active will remains frustrated. Open theism argues God doesn't know the future perfectly and reacts to human choices.
And the authors say,
The authors argue that a frustrated God, a God who wishes the hurricane hadn't happened but couldn't stop it, is no God at all.
the attack on the prosperity gospel is particularly fierce in these pages.
It is. The expert voice in the text details a strict cessationist stance against the prosperity gospel.
Cessationism being the belief that the miraculous sign gifts ceased.
Right, the belief that gifts like controlling weather or instant healing ceased with the apostles. In some modern charismatic circles, people are taught to use the power of the tongue to command the weather, rebuking hurricanes or claiming clear skies by faith.
I've seen videos of that.
The authors describe attempting to bind a hurricane as an act of cosmic treason.
Cosmic treason, that is a heavy phrase.
It is an attempt by a human being to usurp divine authority, trying to snatch the scepter of providence out of the hand of God.
That is a stark warning. The authors also take aim at liberal or seeker-sensitive theology.
The critique there is that liberal theology often tries to apologize for God's hand in suffering. In an attempt to make God more palatable to modern sensibilities, they create a deity who is all-loving but not quite in control of the natural disasters.
Right.
The authors argue forcefully that a God who is not sovereign over the storm is a God who cannot be trusted in the middle of the storm.
It is like trying to comfort someone whose house just blew away by saying, well, God didn't want the tornado to hit your house, he just couldn't stop it.
Which offers zero actual comfort.
None at all.
Yeah.
I compare these modern prosperity preachers trying to command the weather to a passenger sitting back in coach on a commercial airliner.
Right.
They're trying to fly the plane by shouting instructions at the locked cockpit door. It is absurd, it is arrogant, and it completely ignores who is actually qualified to sit in the pilot's seat.
That's a fitting image for the author's charge of cosmic treason. You are a passenger, you are not the pilot.
The text also takes a very aggressive stance against pragmatism and mindfulness as cures for human anxiety.
Which is very countercultural right now.
Very. In today's world, mindfulness, meditation apps, and psychological techniques are widely accepted as beneficial. Why do the authors view these techniques as incompatible with the doctrine of providence?
The authors are making a distinction between subjective coping mechanisms and objective reality.
Break that down.
They argue that true, lasting peace must rely on objective, historical realities. The believer's peace comes from knowing the historical fact that God literally split the Red Sea and literally raised Jesus from the dead.
Okay, facts outside of ourselves.
Right. Mindfulness, in their view, relies on subjective feelings, inward focus, and breathing exercises to manufacture a temporary physiological calm.
So it's just a Band-Aid.
Essentially. The text asserts that looking inward for peace is futile because the human self is fragile and fallen. Looking outward to the objective, meticulous sovereign architect provides an unshakable base that modern psychology simply cannot offer.
It is the difference between convincing yourself you are safe through a breathing exercise versus actually being held in the arms of someone who controls the very oxygen you are breathing.
Beautifully said.
Now, all of this sovereign control over the wind, the water, the earth, and the animals is not attributed to a distant, faceless deity. The authors tie it specifically to the person of Jesus Christ.
Yes, which leads to a very specific vision of the future.
Let's dig into that Christological center.
The theological synthesis here is brilliant. The texts look at Colossians 1:17, which states that in Christ all things hold together. The Greek verb used is synestoken. It is in the perfect tense. In Greek, the perfect tense indicates a completed action with ongoing, continuous results in the present.
So it's not just a past event.
Exactly. Christ actively holds the atoms of the universe together at this very millisecond based on his completed work. The authors also examine Hebrews 1:3, noting the Greek word theon.
Theon, what does that imply?
This implies that Christ is not just statically holding up the universe like the mythical Titan Atlas holding a globe. He is actively carrying the universe forward toward a specific ordained goal.
And the sources draw a direct line from the Old Testament to the Gospels to prove this identity right.
Yes. The analysis points out how the Yahweh of Job chapter 38 is manifested in the human flesh of Jesus of Nazareth.
Job 38, where God speaks from the whirlwind.
Yes. In Job, God challenges humanity out of the whirlwind, asking who shut the sea with doors and commanded the morning.
Then in the Gospels.
In the Gospels, the terrified disciples ask who this man is, that even the wind and sea obey him. The authors conclude that the same hands that commanded the boundaries of the ocean in the primordial past were the exact same hands pierced on the cross at Calvary.
That is a staggering thought. Let me ask a clarifying question about that Greek word theon.
Sure.
You pointed out it implies moving the universe toward a goal, carrying it forward. How does this specific concept counter the secular or Eastern philosophical idea of a cyclical, endless universe where history just repeats itself over and over?
Well, a cyclical universe implies aimlessness. History is just a wheel spinning in the void. There is no destination.
Right.
But theon implies a linear trajectory directed by a sovereign will. Christ is driving the earth, the weather, and human history toward a distinct finish line. The story has an author, and therefore it has a concluding chapter.
And that concluding chapter is what the authors call eschatology, the study of end times. The sources maintain strong dispensational and premillennial commitments. They anticipate a pre-tribulational rapture, followed by tribulation judgments where God will once again use nature, earthquakes, water turning to blood, astronomical signs as instruments of wrath.
And finally, a literal 1,000-year millennial kingdom.
Can you clarify the author's distinction between Israel and the church in this millennial view? We want to ensure you, the listener, grasp the specific dispensational framework being argued here.
Of course, in the dispensational framework presented by the authors, the church and national Israel are distinct entities with distinct promises.
Okay.
The authors reject postmillennialism, which hopes that human effort or the spread of the church will gradually create a utopia on earth. Instead, they argue that the physical restoration of the earth, the reversing of the curse we discussed earlier, is achieved exclusively through the physical return of Christ.
So humans don't bring it about.
Right. During this millennial kingdom, Christ will sit on the literal throne of David in Jerusalem, fulfilling specific territorial and national promises made to Israel in the Old Testament, while the church rules with him in resurrected bodies.
This millennial kingdom is described as the absolute zenith of the doctrine of providence over nature.
The text points to Isaiah 11, where the wolf dwells with the lamb and the leopard lies down with the young goat.
Right. The predatory violence is gone.
Yes. The curse on the ground is lifted. The Christ who governed the falling sparrow during his earthly ministry will visibly govern a restored ecosystem in perfect, majestic peace. The theology of providence finds its ultimate climax in this restored earth.
Okay, we need to bring these vast cosmic theological realities back down to daily life. We must translate this dense doctrine into practical action for the listener.
Application is key.
The sources demand a posture of repentance, specifically for the casual sin of murmuring against the weather.
Which we all do.
We do. The authors argue that complaining about a rainy afternoon ruining your picnic or grumbling about a hot day is essentially a subtle form of arrogance.
It really is. It is telling the Almighty that his management of the cosmos is flawed and that you would do a better job running the thermostat of the universe. It requires immediate repentance.
The doctrine also functions as the ultimate cure for anxiety. If the Father cares for the lilies of the field and the sparrows of the air, he cares for his elect.
And it demands a posture of profound gratitude.
Absolutely. Gratitude for everyday, ordinary mercies. We should be thankful for a simple meal or a safe drive to work, recognizing that neither is guaranteed by independent natural law. Both are daily gifts of active providence.
It requires the humility modeled by Job. When mysteries remain unsolved, when the storm hits and we do not understand why, the biblical response is to lay a hand over our mouth, silencing our accusations against the Creator, and bowing to his superior wisdom.
So, the next time you hear the wind rattle your window, or you watch a single bird land in your yard, ask yourself this. How does my life change if I truly believe that specific gust of air and that exact bird were dispatched by the same hand that holds my salvation?
That changes everything.
It really does. Thank you for joining this deep dive into Reformed thinking. The next time you look at a weather map, you are not just looking at high and low pressure systems, you are looking at the active canvas of the sovereign architect.